No one's allowed to say anything anymore. Maybe you heard that phrase before. People who claim that suddenly everything's forbidden to say or prohibited or regulated by any kind of external resource that prevents them from practicing the right to free speech. We have more and more escalations about that topic. We have more and more effort put into it to deal with these escalations. The question now is, what should we do? And we need to deal with that topic because it gets to an absurd level of how much effort organizations, how many resources they have to spend only to deal with situations that only escalate from some person saying something which in that context was not appropriate. So first things first, we have to talk about some foundational aspects first. Anyone has the right to free speech. Anyone enjoys the right of free speech in any democratic organization in any democratic country. Any democracy supporting organization supports the right to free speech. Of course, the right of free speech is limited by certain factors. One, for example, is the law. There are certain laws in certain countries, in democracies as well, where you say when you say that, it's an offense. Second aspect are ethics and morals, and I know that people say, well, that's a bit of a stretch now because ethics and morals are very personal. Yes, but usually when people start with, ethics and morals are very personal, these people are already aware that they are most likely outside the boundaries that society or the organization set. And of course, there are organizational standards. Your organization will have a certain way of how to communicate, which you should obey. So laws, ethics and morals, and organizational standards are the three aspects that might, in certain context, limit your right to free speech. What is, of course, and just to be very clear about that, not legitimate and often also not legal, that there are random standards where single people say you can't say this anymore, you can't say that anymore, where just one person tells you you're not allowed to say that anymore without giving you any reason. That's like just making a political party led by just one person, most likely the person who founded it, like a Führer principle in this case. Absolutely not. That is never a legitimate way. There needs to be a substantiation of how is that person legitimized. There are rules to that, there are laws to that, and then you can set standards. It can't happen that a person XYZ says that word is not okay, and especially not without reason. The question now is, do we have any examples and how do we put things in practice when we now say, hey, we have certain standards? And I brought with me a couple of real world examples here. Example number one is Elon Musk. Surprise, surprise at Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the self-declared knight of free speech, as he says. At the same time, he says the word cis, as in cisgender. I mean, when you look into scientific discourse, you have transgender, you have cisgender, and the word cis, according to Elon Musk, is a slur, which is at X, formerly Twitter, his company, is labeled accordingly. So he says he's all in for free speech and then just pulls up a random word, saying, I don't like this word, so from now on, this is a slur and your account will be limited as soon as you use it. Yeah, that's the new knighthood of free speech, isn't it? That would be if your company says, well, you can't say strawberry because, our CEO said strawberry is a slur now. And that, of course, is not possible. There are scientific standards. You have to obey scientific standards because this is the standard we all work with, at least sane people do so. If you say, no, scientific standards are not for me, don't be surprised when your clients run away and when your organization suffers in a huge amount, as we see with X, formerly Twitter, led by Elon Musk at the moment. The company is not doing well. But of course, we don't need well-known global billionaires to say something which is wildly inappropriate or make something up which is wildly inappropriate. We also have rules of when can you say something in what context. Example here from Real World, the Pennsylvania Department of Transport. An employee of the company posted on her private Facebook account that she's really annoyed by school buses and she would be happy to crash into one, especially as the safety and security of children is only with the parents, not with the state. It's the parents' obligation to keep their people and their children safe, not anyone else, especially not the state's task to do so. Consequence was the person was fired for that. Laid off, terminated for that posting. Of course, a huge backlash came when the person posted this, not about firing the person, but some people said, well, This is a private posting, and that's what the person claimed as well. In my private time, I can say whatever I want, and you cannot hold me accountable for that. So they went to court, and against my personal surprise, but I'm happy about the result, I have to say, the person was fired and was not reinstated for employment. So the person lost in all instances, including the cost that needed to be covered. Very important here is when you post something which is wildly against the standards, when you, for example, say, Department of Transport, your job is to bring children home safe, and you say, I don't care about their safety, I would happily crash into a school bus, and that as a person from the Department of Transport, then of course you cannot work for the Department of Transport. Let's say your company, just to give you an example, when you say, our company sells chocolate, and on your private account you post, I think chocolate is a human crime and anyone who eats chocolate should be hanged, then they rightfully would terminate you for that. You cannot work for an organization when you personally are obviously wildly engaged in going against the standards of your organization. When, for example, you work for an organization that says, we thrive on diversity, equity, and inclusion, anyone's welcome here to bring their full self to work, and you are part of a nationalist, monocultural movement, it's perfectly fine to exclude you from promotions or to remove you from the organization. That's just logical behavior. When you sell spoons and someone would say spoons are a crime, never buy spoons on their private account, you wouldn't hire them to be anyone for them in any position. Perfectly right to show people consequences for their freedom of speech. And by the way, still, freedom of speech, anyone can say whatever they want. However, you also need to see the consequences. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom of consequences. Another example, the third one here, Rainer Gardner, German, who was in China for Daimler, the big company which also deals with Mercedes-Benz. And he said, and trigger warning here, I'm just quoting to give you the proof, otherwise I would never say the words which are coming right now. Rainer Gardner told a driver, and I quote, he's in China, Rainer Gardner said to a driver when he was driving in China. So told the driver, and I quote word by word, I'm in China for more than a year now, and what I learned so far, the first thing I learned was all you Chinese are bastards. And Daimler did the only right thing and fired him. And by the way, we didn't find any track record of Rainer Gardner resurfacing somewhere on any relevant position from there. Of course, that statement is wildly unacceptable. First, racist as it gets when you, white and male, which means birthright privileged person, utter anything like that, you need to be removed. You lose all your credibility, and of course, you cannot say anything like you can't go to a country. You want to have their resources, their infrastructure, their resource, anything. You want their money, you want their market, their customers, and then you say anything like that. And besides that, making racist statements doesn't meet anyone's standards, except when you're a racist. And let's face it, organizations don't thrive on racism, and they never did. Very important here, it was the right decision to do so. So of course you have the right to speech. However, you might face consequences afterwards. No one prevented these people from saying that what they said. However, there is no guarantee that people agree with you. And that is a major, major difference, that people often perceive that when I say something, there must be zero consequences. And this often comes from people who saw very little consequences so far in their lives. How do we now implement this in organizations? And of course, this might be very challenging. So first things first here, there is an assumption of innocence for absolutely anyone. When someone says this statement is wildly unacceptable, then there needs to be proof, and the burden of evidence is with you. You need to have an examination. Anyone who is an eyewitness, or in this case, ear witness maybe, needs to be heard, and at the end there's a decision. However, the assumption of innocence applies to absolutely anyone when, of course, you have proof of what they have done. So you have a recording, or the person admitted they said what they said. Then, of course, when it is part of being guilty, the assumption of innocence is there, but when they admit they are guilty, and then consequences need to happen. You, of course, need to train your people on where are the boundaries of what you should and should not say when you work for our organization. What kind of boundaries do we have? So first, we have boundaries on the subject matter. Real-world example here. When you are, and I give you the example from a logistics company here, a logistics company on the market said, hey, we do XYZ, we package things and travel from A to B, bringing these things from one place to the other. One part was sending parcels. And then they told their sales team, do not mention when you sell our services, we are cheaper than the other company on that kind of parcel. And there were multiple reasons why they set the boundary saying, do not mention we are cheaper. One, they were a premium brand. They didn't want to be known for being the cheapest. B, they didn't want to have a price war on the market. And third, they said, we simply are cheaper on that kind of packaging, but in other categories, we are more expensive. So it's not really honest saying we're the cheapest because we are not on all counts, all instances, all products. And that is a typical example of a subject matter boundary. On a certain subject, a company, an organization, your employer sets you a certain limit that limits your free speech, that limits what you say towards the client. And by the way, in my industry, as a trainer, coach, mentor, consultant, speaker, name it as you like, they booked me for a speak. They booked me for a speech, and then they sent me a piece of paper. And it was a pharmaceuticals company. And on this piece of paper, they said, here are the rules. And the rules, for example, definitely excluded that I can mention other pharmaceutical companies or other pharmaceutical products except their own. And the reason for that was they wanted to learn structurally how to lead better, communicate better, sell better. However, they didn't want to have the let's talk down on someone. They didn't want to have the, oh, look at how company XYZ failed miserably there, or look how we are better than they are, because that is not going to be sustainable. Any organization will make mistakes sooner or later, and then suddenly this whole concept of, oh, look, we are better than them doesn't work anymore. So even in my job, where freedom of speech is number one part of what I do, there are rules to what I can and cannot say. And by the way, if you don't like these rules, just get booked by someone else. Find different clients. No one forces you to work for certain organizations. Very important here. The second aspect of limitations and boundaries here are moral boundaries. So, for example, when someone says, hey, we want to be very attractive in recruiting, and I give you a real-world example here. During a trade fair, one HR leader said, hey, we're a real men's club, so you can be a real men, because we don't hire women that often, because, that just doesn't fit our industry. We're a real hard-working, heavy-lifting company, so it's more like men, and you can behave like men. So first, that HR leader was removed quite quickly, rightfully so. Second, this is illegal. It is just discrimination, nothing else. You cannot exclude people based on gender by generalizing that they don't fit or whatever you claim there. And of course, when you have moral and ethical standards, you cannot simply say, we put something out there to just cater to one audience and discriminate against anyone else. So that's a moral limitation. And the third limitation, the third boundary, are legal limits. When you, for example, in certain industries say, hey, I have this very nice nutrition, which is additional new nutrition to your daily meal. When you say it heals certain sufferings, it heals XYZ, then you have to give proof. There is a reason why these dubious supplements company never say our supplements heal condition XYZ. They always say, oh, let's make our customers talk. And then you have these actors who say, oh, I was feeling so bad, and then I ate your supplements, and now I'm feeling so great, and all my condition XYZ situations are all gone. So that's just an opinion by someone. That's how they get around these legal issues. Nothing else than a cheap and, of course, immoral trick. There are legal limitations to what you can say. You cannot make something up and then just make profit out of that. So the legal limitations have to be accepted as well. There are additional aspects to that. So, for example, you need client analysis. How do you want to address certain people? How do you want to talk to them? When you want to sell financial products and address them by, hey, yo, bro, what's up? You most likely will not meet your target audience. If you, for example, want to talk to young people and you send them emails saying, dear Mr. Such-and-so, dear Mrs. Such-and-so, dear person such-and-so. So probably email is not their first means of communication, and being addressed like that probably is not very convincing for them to buy your products. And by the way, a catastrophic example of how not to deal with, how to address someone is Deutsche Bahn, the German train company. There was someone, so far they only had two addresses. They had Mr. and Mrs. And one person said, well, I'm neither of the two. And as we all know, there are more than two genders. By the way, if you now say, oh no, there aren't, it's all woke nonsense, blah, blah, blah. Please stick to science. Please read up. Please inform yourself on a scientific level before you keep on embarrassing yourself. So as they are more than two genders, there must be more than two addressings. And Deutsche Bahn said, no, we don't care. So the person went to court and won in all instances. And Deutsche Bahn not only had to cover all the costs, also had to carry on with the brand damage they produced here. I have no idea which manager or executive decided to go to court on here and not just surrender in round one and say, maybe we were wrong, we're very sorry. I have no idea who decided that, but it was probably not the most competent person on the matter. So you have a client analysis. How do you address your clients? One of the additional aspects you have to do when it comes to communication and free speech is you need to give people unconscious bias training. Unconscious bias means that you judge something unconsciously due to certain conditions. I give you an example. When someone sends you a job application, and then you probably research their name and you find their Instagram profile, Facebook profile, LinkedIn profile. So when you now say, with all the information I have, I just give the job to the most competent person, you don't. There are certain aspects that influence who you see, how you see this person. Aspect number one, when you have their LinkedIn, most likely you see a photo. Photo immediately influences you. Then you have a name. When the name sounds foreign to you, Mr. Smith effect, it is more likely that you are not going to hire someone with a foreign name. And then, of course, the address, when you say, oh, bad part of the city, since when do we have that kind of people applying here? So there are many aspects which influence you in a very random way, and you have to deal with the fact that unconscious bias training is needed. When you see who is claiming today that they are very much offended by any limitation of speaking, it usually comes from people who never had to face scrutiny for whatever they said. And usually this comes from the category of people who are birthright privileged. Usually white, male, straight, cisgender, privileged by birthright, fourth generation academic and often wealthy or whatever else. So people who never had to face any kind of scrutiny, and suddenly there is the tiniest bit of scrutiny coming up and they are very much offended by that. So you need this unconscious bias training to make people aware of the fact that much of their career might have been relying on birthright privileges way more than their skills. So the unconscious bias training here is a must-have. In the English-speaking world, it is standard to have that. In progressive German organizations, you see that as well. However, the German-speaking market is far behind. When you go to other industries and when you go to other countries, they're even further behind than that. You need to have unconscious bias training. All of that together, and you see how complex this is now, needs to be put into policy. So you have something where people can stick to, people can say, hey, look, our code of communication, that's the way we talk. And then these policies have to be trained professionally by qualified people. And by the way, training people on meeting certain standards is the standard for many, many years. It is not new. When you have a product and the product is called Mac Hamburger and someone says, oh yeah, just call it hamburger, it's close enough, isn't it? Then you will say, no, we have a product name, a brand name, and we need to get it out there exactly in the way we want to have the story told, the product presented, and the whole twist around it build up. And that's why you train people how to call things, how to present them, and what kind of twist and story you give with the whole product. It's just setting standards. It happens for decades, so don't pretend it's new. And of course, now some people might wonder, are there any kind of warning signs where you can tell me, well, when I see or hear this, there might be a bit of an issue? And yes, there are warning signs. Maybe you heard when someone says, oh, today it's all woke or it's all lefty green stuff. No, it's not. But when someone uses woke as a pejorative, nothing smart has ever been said after that. Usually people say something is woke when suddenly empathy turned up, or suddenly they are not the person that can simply say anything with zero consequence, which they've probably done for 2 or 3 decades before on their job. So when someone says woke as a pejorative, massive warning sign. Anytime someone generalizes, everything is XYZ, that usually doesn't go down well. When people say, oh, today no one's allowed to say anything anymore. Today no one is allowed to do XYZ anymore. These kind of generalizations, always a big warning sign. And one of the biggest ones is when people say, oh, so back in the days, people weren't so easily offended. That usually comes from a generation which, when they grew up and they started to get into the working world, people were offended when a non-white person was drinking from the same fountain or sitting on the same bus or next to them at school. So back in those days where they claim no one was offended, that simply meant they set the rules, often massively racist, condescending, or both, or even more unacceptable on other counts. And they say no one was offended because they simply could do the wildest, unhinged things with zero consequence. And that now comes to an end. So when someone said no one was offended back in the days, by the way, when someone suddenly says you can't say, oh, look at that sexy woman at work anymore, the only person offended right now obviously is you, because you're offended by not being allowed to be sexist anymore. So you are the one being offended, not the women who just stick to their right of not being reduced to outer appearance. So as soon as someone says no one was offended back in the days, massive warning sign. However, and that is something I need to add here, when people make mistakes, the first thing is not to lay them off immediately, always depending, of course, on the offense. When someone makes massively sexist, misogynistic, or racist remarks, off they go, and that's perfectly fine. Society changes, and often, especially leaders, executive managers, talk about how we have to adapt to change. So first, they have to live up to their own standards, meaning when things change, you have to do as well, walk the talk. Obviously, when someone makes narrow, tiny mistakes, the first thing you do is you have to train and coach them again. And by the way, when you now say, oh yeah, we have an amazing training program, it's an online course people can watch during their lunch break, then it's your managers and executives' fault. You need to hire professional trainers to get professional results, not buy the $49 online class that no one's going to watch because they only press play and then get back to work. And when the video comes to an end and they get questioned, did you watch it? They click yes, and that was it. That's not training. It has nothing to do with training, and it never had. You need to hire professional people to deliver these training or coaching sessions. And yes, that is an investment, but you have to make it. Otherwise, you see the consequences of not doing it, which is way more expensive. So very important is when people make mistakes, they have a right of rehabilitation, always depending on how bad their offense was. Of course, it always needs to stay in a certain context. And of course, you always have to see, is it possible that the offender and the victim get together again in a working context? Is there any kind of balance, any kind of thing that can be repaid, or how the damage can be recovered between the offender and the victim? And if not, the more and the closer you come to a no, the more likely it is you cannot keep that person on your roster. What does not work is that you have the following situation where people say, hey, look, they made this massively racist remark. And you say, yeah, we know it's not great, but, they're from a different generation and they're really important in sales. So we need the cash. So let's just keep the racist. No, you can't, because then anyone can misbehave as badly towards you, and there are zero moments to complain, and you don't want to have that happening in your organization. So be aware of these warning signs. Taken together, just wrapping this up, freedom of speech always was and always is granted in any democracy and any democracy supporting organizations. However, very important is in that phrase you have to remember, freedom of speech does not mean freedom of repercussion. And when you stick to that rule, things will get better immediately. And when you now say, whoa, that's complex. Yes, it is. I know. This episode here happened because I received a lot of requests on how do we deal with this topic. And if you now have either something to discuss, you have questions, or you just want to make a comment, or you have probably another idea you like to talk about, feel free to drop me a message. nb@nb-networks.com is my email address. You find my email address also in the show notes of this podcast. You also find my LinkedIn there, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well, and we can chat there as well. Or go straight to my website, www.nb-networks.biz, and then we take it from there. One additional aspect which I recommend, because sometimes people say, well, I have a leader who really should listen to that, but I know they don't listen to podcasts. They're traveling constantly. Do you have an article about this? And yes, we always have the audio version, and we have a very much of a summary kind of style, because I know that people have the urge to get everything in a very compressed way today. We have articles with that. However, when you want to get access to that, you need access to our leadership letter. When you go to expert.nb-networks.com, then you can find way to put your email address in there. You only receive one email every Wednesday morning. It's 100% content at free guarantee. Free access to everything I published on audio level, on print level, on level of blogs and everything. Everything is free access from there at no charge for our readers and listeners. So I'm looking forward to being in touch with you there as well. However, the third aspect is the most important one. Apply what you heard in this podcast, because only when you apply what you heard, you will see the positive change that you obviously want to see in your organization. I wish you all the best doing so. I'm available for help 24/7. If you now say, hey, can I send you an email? We maybe need a training or a coaching or a speaking at or event. Yes, we can talk about all of that, but you can also just send me an email or a message on any platform and say, hey, let's just have a chat. Yeah, so I'm open for anything. Feel free to contact me 24/7. So I'm always available for help. And at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Thank you very much for your time.